In the tapestry of Roman history, few figures are as brightly colored, as intensely debated, or as ultimately tragic as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, forever etched in historical memory as Elagabalus. Thrust onto the throne of the Roman Empire at the tender age of 14, this Syrian youth transported with him not only the purple robes of power, but also the exotic religious practices and unconventional personal behaviors that would ignite a firestorm of controversy in the heart of Rome. His 4-year reign became a crucible, testing the very foundations of Roman society, challenging its political norms and questioning its deeply ingrained religious traditions. The tale of Elagabalus transcends mere accounts of imperial decadence or youthful indiscretion. It represents a profound cultural collision, a confrontation between the established order of the West and the alluring mystique of the East, between the staunchly traditional values of Rome and the revolutionary fervor of foreign religious beliefs, between the rigid confines of established gender roles and the liberating potential of radical self-expression. His reign, though brief, exposed the deep-seated vulnerabilities within Roman society, vulnerabilities that would contribute to the escalating crisis that engulfed the empire during the turbulent 3rd century. To truly comprehend the seismic impact of Elagabalus's reign, it is essential to first understand the tumultuous context of his era. The early 3rd century was a watershed moment for Rome, a period of unprecedented transformation and mounting unease. While the empire had reached its zenith under Trajan, its vast borders stretched to their breaking point, and insidious cracks were beginning to appear in its seemingly impenetrable facade. Relentless military pressure from barbarian tribes along the frontiers, coupled with growing economic instability and increasingly frequent political upheavals, created an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty that would come to define this critical juncture in Roman history. The Severan dynasty into which Elagabalus was born had ushered in an era of unprecedented African and Syrian influence at the highest echelons of Roman power. Septimius Severus, Elagabalus's great-great-uncle, had seized control through sheer military force, and his successors continued to rely heavily on the unwavering support of the army to maintain their legitimacy. This precarious dependence on the military would prove to be a crucial factor in understanding how a teenage Syrian priest could ascend to the pinnacle of Roman power. Syria itself was a land steeped in ancient history, a melting pot of civilizations, and a cradle of exotic religions. For centuries, it had served as a vital crossroads where the vibrant cultures of Greece, Persia, Rome, and the Semitic world converged and intertwined. The religious traditions of this region predated Rome by millennia, their roots stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. The solar deity Elagabal, whose priesthood Elagabalus inherited, represented one of these enduring and powerful traditions. Central to the worship of Elagabal was a sacred black stone, believed to be a meteorite fallen from the heavens, enshrined within a magnificent temple in Emesa. This deity was inextricably linked to the sun, to the concepts of fertility and abundance, and to the divine right of kingship. The rituals surrounding this enigmatic god were elaborate and often deeply symbolic, involving ecstatic dance, mesmerizing processions, and other practices that would strike many Romans as profoundly alien and unsettling. The priests of Elagabal wielded immense influence in Syrian society, serving not only as religious leaders, but also as key political figures. Julia Domna, the influential Syrian empress and wife of Septimius Severus, had already introduced these Eastern influences into the heart of Roman power. Her sister, Julia Maesa, and her nieces, Julia Soaemias and Julia Mamea, would continue this tradition, wielding a degree of power and influence that far exceeded what Roman women traditionally enjoyed, shaping the political landscape of the empire. It was this formidable network of powerful Syrian women who would ultimately orchestrate Elagabalus's audacious rise to power. The political landscape that made it possible for a teenage priest to become emperor began with the assassination of the Emperor Caracalla in 217 AD. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who masterminded Caracalla's death, seized the throne, but quickly proved unable to secure the unwavering loyalty of the crucial Eastern legions. Sensing an opportunity, the astute Syrian women of the imperial family saw a chance to reclaim their lost power and began to meticulously plot their return to prominence. Julia Maesa, banished from the court by Macrinus, initiated a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. She shrewdly spread rumors that her grandson, Elagabalus, was in fact the illegitimate son of the popular and charismatic Caracalla. This audacious claim, regardless of its veracity, provided the essential dynastic legitimacy needed to directly challenge Macrinus's claim to the throne. The young priest, bearing a striking resemblance to Caracalla and exuding an undeniable exotic charisma, became the central figure in a rebellion that threatened to tear the empire apart. The revolt erupted in May of 218 AD at the legionary camp near Emesa. Julia Maesa had secretly bribed key officers and soldiers with generous promises of substantial donatives and significant pay increases. When Elagabalus appeared before the 3rd Gallica Legion, adorned in the imperial purple, and boldly proclaiming himself to be Caracalla's son, the emboldened soldiers immediately hailed him as their rightful emperor. The rebellion rapidly spread throughout the eastern provinces as news of the young emperor's claimed parentage and lavish promises reached other legions, igniting a wave of support. Macrinus, caught completely off guard by the sudden and swift escalation of the revolt, desperately attempted to suppress it militarily. However, his forces were decisively defeated at the pivotal Battle of Antioch in June of 218 AD. The emperor, who had confidently believed himself to be secure, watched in dismay as his support rapidly evaporated as legion after legion declared their allegiance to the teenage claimant. Macrinus, his power base crumbling around him, fled towards Rome in a desperate attempt to rally support, but he was captured and executed before he could reach the capital. The stunning victory at Antioch catapulted Elagabalus, at the remarkably young age of 14, to the pinnacle of power as the undisputed master of the Roman Empire. However, the true power behind the throne resided with his astute grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his ambitious mother, Julia Soaemius, who had meticulously orchestrated his ascent. These shrewd women understood that maintaining control would require carefully balancing the delicate needs of both the powerful army and the influential Roman Senate. What they perhaps failed to anticipate was the extent to which their young puppet would develop his own radical agenda, one that would challenge the very fabric of Roman society. The long journey from Syria to Rome took over a year, a period during which Elagabalus consolidated his power and began to unveil his true character, much to the growing consternation of many in Rome. Unlike previous boy emperors who had been content to allow regents to rule in their name, Elagabalus displayed an early and unwavering determination to exercise real authority. His first actions included the swift execution of known supporters of Macrinus and the appointment of his own loyal allies to key positions within the government. During this transitional period, increasingly troubling reports began to reach Rome regarding the new emperor's unconventional behavior and radical intentions. Whispers and rumors spread of his exotic religious practices, his flamboyant and androgynous appearance, and his audacious plans to fundamentally transform Roman religion. Traditional Romans, already deeply suspicious of the growing Eastern influences within the empire, began to harbor grave concerns about what this Syrian priest-emperor would bring to their venerable city. The grand entry of Elagabalus into Rome in 219 AD marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent and controversial reigns in Roman history. The young emperor arrived not as a conquering Roman general celebrating a hard-won triumph, but rather as an exotic Eastern potentate, ostentatiously surrounded by all the opulent trappings of Syrian royalty. His very appearance was enough to shock the sensibilities of traditional Romans. He favored lavish silk robes, elaborate makeup, and ostentatious jewelry, adornments that no self-respecting Roman man would ever dare to wear. However, even more alarming than his personal appearance was what he brought with him from Syria, the sacred black stone of Elagabal itself. This enigmatic meteorite, carefully transported from Emesa at great expense, was to be installed in a newly constructed and magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Rome. For Romans, this unprecedented act represented a religious revolution of the most profound and unsettling kind. Never before in their long history had a foreign deity been elevated to such a position of prominence and power within their empire. The religious transformation that Elagabalus initiated went far beyond simply adding another deity to the already crowded Roman pantheon. He boldly proclaimed Elagabal to be the supreme deity, far superior to even Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods. Traditional Roman gods were to be relegated to subordinate positions, subservient to this Syrian solar deity. The emperor himself would serve as the god's high priest, performing daily rituals that many Romans found bizarre, disturbing, and even sacrilegious. The rituals surrounding Elagabal involved elements that directly violated deeply ingrained Roman religious sensibilities. Sacred ecstatic dancing, elaborate processions through the streets of Rome, and the sacrifice of animals became daily occurrences in the capital. The emperor himself actively participated in these ceremonies, often wearing full priestly regalia, including flowing robes, a jeweled crown, and elaborate makeup. To conservative Romans, these displays represented a fundamental and unacceptable attack on their most cherished religious traditions. The sexual and gender aspects of these religious practices proved to be even more controversial, pushing the boundaries of what Roman society could tolerate. The worship of Elagabal included fertility rituals and gender-fluid religious expressions that had ancient roots in Syrian tradition but were completely foreign and deeply unsettling to Roman sensibilities. Elagabalus's own participation in these rituals, including his adoption of feminine dress and mannerisms during certain ceremonies, scandalized Roman society and fueled the growing opposition to his reign. The emperor's personal relationships became a constant source of gossip, outrage, and political maneuvering. His marriage to Julia Paula, a respectable Roman noblewoman, lasted less than a year before he divorced her to marry Aquilia Severan, a Vestal virgin. This shocking union violated one of Rome's most sacred taboos, as Vestal virgins were consecrated to the goddess Vesta and bound by strict vows of chastity and lifelong virginity. The marriage was widely seen as both sacrilege and a direct assault on Roman religious law and tradition. Even more shocking to Roman sensibilities were Elagabalus's relationships with men. Historical sources, particularly Cassius Dio and the often sensational Historia Augusta, describe his marriages to male partners, including his well-publicized relationship with a charioteer named Hierocles, and later with an athlete named Zodicus. These relationships were conducted with the full ceremony and legal recognition of marriage, with Elagabalus often adopting the traditional role of the wife. The emperor's gender expression became increasingly fluid and controversial, further fueling the fires of opposition. Sources describe him wearing wigs, makeup, and women's clothing, and expressing a desire to be addressed as empress rather than emperor. Some accounts even suggest that he sought medical procedures to alter his anatomy, offering enormous rewards to any physician who could successfully transform him physically into a woman. While the historical accuracy of these specific claims remains a subject of debate among historians, they nonetheless reflect the profound unease and moral panic that his behavior generated within Roman society. The political implications of these personal and religious changes were enormous, creating a dangerous rift between the emperor and the Roman establishment. The Roman Senate, already deeply suspicious of the growing Eastern influences within the empire, found itself increasingly marginalized and forced to participate in religious rituals that they considered degrading, foreign, and utterly incompatible with Roman values. Senators were required to attend religious ceremonies where they were forced to witness practices that directly violated their understanding of proper Roman behavior and religious observance. The emperor's blatant disregard for Roman military traditions proved to be equally problematic, alienating a crucial power base. While previous emperors had at least maintained the pretense of martial valor, Elagabalus showed little interest in military affairs, focusing instead on ensuring the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard through lavish donatives and extravagant displays of wealth. His appearances at military ceremonies in Eastern dress, his lack of interest in frontier campaigns, and his elevation of civilian priests to high-ranking military commands deeply alienated the officer corps, undermining their confidence in his leadership. The economic policies enacted under Elagabalus reflected both the Syrian court's insatiable extravagance and the emperor's profound disconnect from Roman fiscal realities. Massive expenditures on lavish religious ceremonies, extravagant gifts to favored courtiers, and the construction of opulent new temples placed an unbearable strain on the imperial treasury. Traditional Roman virtues of frugality, restraint, and fiscal responsibility were abandoned in favor of Eastern concepts of royal magnificence and conspicuous consumption. The emperor's court became a veritable theater of excess, a spectacle that horrified traditional Romans. Elaborate banquets featured exotic foods, outlandish entertainment that included acts that many Romans considered perverted and debauched, and a level of luxury that far exceeded even the notorious excesses of infamous emperors like Caligula or Nero. The emperor himself presided over these gatherings in elaborate costumes that changed multiple times during single events, further fueling the perception of decadence and waste. Palace intrigue reached new levels of complexity and danger as various factions relentlessly competed for influence over the young and impressionable emperor. Syrian courtiers, Roman senators desperately seeking to maintain their relevance, ambitious military commanders, and zealous religious officials all maneuvered for position, each vying to gain the emperor's favor and advance their own agendas. Even the emperor's own family members found themselves walking a delicate tightrope, attempting to balance their support for his policies with the need to protect their own positions and secure their own survival in the treacherous world of Roman court politics. The transformation of the imperial palace into what essentially amounted to a Syrian temple complex represented a physical manifestation of the cultural revolution that Elagabalus was attempting to impose upon Rome. Traditional Roman architectural elements were systematically supplemented or outright replaced with Eastern decorative schemes, reflecting the emperor's desire to reshape the very fabric of Roman society in his own image. The sacred black stone of Elagabal was housed in a specially constructed shrine that dominated the palace complex, becoming the focal point of the emperor's religious and political agenda. Daily life in the palace revolved around an endless series of religious observances that consumed increasing amounts of time, resources, and energy. Multiple ceremonies each day required the mandatory participation of the emperor and his entire court. These elaborate rituals often lasted for hours and involved practices that Roman observers found both exhausting and utterly pointless. The emperor's insistence on personally presiding over every ceremony meant that affairs of state were frequently interrupted or delayed, hindering the efficient functioning of the Roman government. The psychological pressure exerted on those forced to participate in these ceremonies was immense. Roman senators and officials found themselves required to witness and sometimes even participate in rituals that directly violated their most deeply held religious beliefs and social conditioning, forcing them to make difficult choices between their personal convictions and their political survival. Some adapted by viewing these requirements as necessary diplomatic formalities, a pragmatic acceptance of the new reality, while others began to secretly plot resistance, seeking ways to undermine the emperor's authority and restore traditional Roman values. Foreign diplomats and visiting dignitaries were subjected to the same stringent ceremonial requirements, creating international incidents that damaged Rome's reputation and strained its relationships with key allies. Traditional allies found themselves unsure how to respond to an emperor who seemed more interested in religious ritual than in matters of statecraft, while enemy nations began to view Rome as weakened by internal conflict and distracted leadership, potentially creating opportunities for aggression. The response of the Roman populace to these sweeping changes was mixed at first, but gradually turned increasingly negative. While some citizens were initially curious about the exotic Eastern practices and the novelty of the new religious order, most came to resent the disruption to their traditional religious observances, viewing the emperor's actions as an affront to their cultural heritage. The emperor's decree that Roman festivals be modified to honor Elagabal created widespread resentment among ordinary citizens, who saw it as an attempt to erase their own traditions and impose a foreign religion upon them. Even the gladiatorial games, a cornerstone of Roman popular entertainment, were altered to incorporate religious elements that significantly reduced their appeal, alienating a large segment of the population. Traditional beast hunts and combat exhibitions were replaced or supplemented with religious pageants that audiences found boring, incomprehensible, and utterly lacking in the visceral excitement they had come to expect. The emperor's own appearances at these events, invariably dressed in outlandish Eastern regalia, were met with increasingly hostile reactions, further isolating him from the people he was supposed to govern. The economic impacts of the reign began to directly affect ordinary Romans as increased taxation was imposed to fund the emperor's ambitious religious projects and the extravagant lifestyle of his court. Merchants found their businesses disrupted by frequent religious holidays and ceremonial requirements, which forced them to close their shops and lose valuable trading days. Artisans were increasingly pressed into service, creating religious objects and decorations for the endless series of ceremonies, diverting their skills and resources from more productive activities. The military situation along the frontiers deteriorated as resources were diverted from defense in favor of court ceremonials, leaving Rome vulnerable to attack. Reports of barbarian incursions increased as the emperor focused on religious matters, leaving the frontiers poorly defended. Veteran officers began to openly question whether a leader who appeared to be more interested in priestly duties than in military strategy could effectively command Rome's legions and protect its vast empire. Provincial administration suffered as governors and administrators found themselves required to implement unpopular religious changes that local populations actively resisted, creating instability and unrest. In some areas, particularly in the western provinces, open rebellion against imperial religious policies began to emerge, further destabilizing the empire. The emperor's response was typically to increase penalties for non-compliance, further alienating the population and exacerbating the underlying tensions. The breaking point came when Elagabalus began to directly interfere with traditional Roman marriage customs and deeply ingrained family structures, challenging the very foundations of Roman society. His open promotion of sexual practices and relationships that Romans considered deviant and morally reprehensible created a crisis of social legitimacy, undermining the traditional values that had long defined Roman identity. When he attempted to formalize these radical changes through legal reforms, resistance crystallized into active opposition, uniting disparate factions against him. Julia Maesa, the emperor's own grandmother, who had shrewdly orchestrated his rise to power, began to recognize that his increasingly erratic and unpopular reign threatened the very survival of the Severan dynasty. Secret communications with key military commanders and influential senators revealed a growing consensus that a change in leadership was absolutely necessary to prevent the empire from collapsing into chaos. The challenge was finding a suitable successor who could maintain Syrian influence while simultaneously abandoning the most controversial and damaging aspects of Elagabalus's radical program. The selection of Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, as an alternative represented a carefully calculated attempt to preserve dynastic power while eliminating the source of the widespread controversy. Alexander was younger, more malleable, and crucially, had not been directly associated with the religious extremism and social radicalism that had come to define his cousin's disastrous reign. Julia Maesa began to carefully cultivate support for a transition that would peacefully remove Elagabalus from power while ensuring the continuation of family control over the empire. Military opposition to Elagabalus centered on the powerful Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had been maintained through generous payments and lavish promises, but whose patience was wearing increasingly thin. The emperor's blatant disregard for Roman military traditions, his elevation of unqualified favorites to positions of command, and his obvious lack of interest in military affairs had alienated even those who had initially benefited from his largesse, creating a breeding ground for discontent. The conspiracy that would ultimately end Elagabalus's tumultuous reign began to take shape in early 222 AD, bringing together a diverse group of individuals united by their opposition to the emperor's policies. Key participants included his own grandmother, leading senators, disgruntled Praetorian commanders, and even some court officials who had grown weary of the constant ceremonial demands and the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior. The plot required careful coordination to ensure that the transition would be swift, decisive, and relatively bloodless, minimizing the risk of civil war. The psychological state of the emperor himself had become increasingly unstable as opposition to his reign mounted. Historical sources describe episodes of paranoia, fits of uncontrollable rage, and increasingly irrational behavior, suggesting that the immense pressure of ruling the Roman Empire was taking a severe toll on his mental health. His typical response to criticism was to increase the severity of punishments and the frequency of religious observances, further isolating himself and alienating potential supporters. Warning signs of the coming crisis multiplied throughout the winter of 221–222 AD, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension within the imperial court. The emperor's increasing isolation from traditional sources of support, combined with his apparent inability to recognize the depth of opposition to his policies, created a situation where a violent and decisive change became almost inevitable. Even his closest supporters began to distance themselves from him as the political situation rapidly deteriorated, sensing the impending collapse of his regime. The actual assassination of Elagabalus occurred on March 11, 222 AD, during what should have been a routine ceremony at the Praetorian camp, a place that had been a source of strength for previous emperors. The emperor had gone there with his cousin Alexander Severus to address the guards, completely unaware that the visit was actually a carefully orchestrated trap designed to remove him from power. When he arrived, he found himself facing guards who had already declared their unwavering support for Alexander, signaling the end of his reign. The scene that followed was both chaotic and brutally decisive. Elagabalus attempted to assert his authority, but quickly found that his usual commanding presence had no effect on soldiers who had already made up their minds to remove him from the throne. His desperate attempts to flee were futile, as the conspirators had carefully prepared for every contingency, ensuring that there would be no escape. The young emperor, who had once commanded absolute obedience and wielded immense power, was now utterly powerless against the very forces that had brought him to power. The killing of Elagabalus was swift, brutal, and thorough. Contemporary accounts describe how the 18-year-old emperor was struck down by multiple assailants, ensuring that there would be no possibility of survival. His mother, Julia Soaemius, who had accompanied him to the camp, met the same violent fate, becoming a casualty of the power struggle that had consumed her family. With their deaths, the Syrian faction that had dominated Roman politics for the past several years was effectively eliminated in a matter of minutes. The disposal of the bodies represented a final act of rejection of everything Elagabalus had stood for, a symbolic cleansing of the empire from his controversial influence. Rather than receiving the traditional cremation and elaborate burial accorded to Roman emperors, the corpses were unceremoniously dragged through the streets of Rome and eventually thrown into the murky waters of the Tiber River. This ignominious treatment, typically reserved for common criminals and traitors, sent a clear and unambiguous message about how history would ultimately judge his reign. The immediate aftermath of the assassination saw a systematic erasure of Elagabalus's religious and social innovations, a deliberate attempt to restore traditional Roman values. The sacred black stone of Elagabal was returned to Syria. The temples dedicated to the Eastern deity were rededicated to traditional Roman gods, and the ceremonial requirements that had dominated court life were swiftly abandoned, signaling a return to normalcy. Alexander Severus, guided by his astute mother, Julia Mamaia, and his powerful grandmother, Julia Maesa, initiated a comprehensive restoration of traditional Roman practices, undoing much of the damage that had been inflicted during Elagabalus's reign. The damnatio memoria imposed on Elagabalus was comprehensive and far-reaching, but ultimately not entirely successful. While official records were altered and inscriptions were changed in an attempt to erase his memory from history, the extraordinary nature of his reign ensured that it would persist in historical accounts and popular memory, defying the attempts at obliteration. The very extremity of his innovations ensured that they would be remembered, even if only as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of adhering to traditional values. The historical assessment of Elagabalus has evolved significantly over the centuries, reflecting changing cultural attitudes and evolving historical methodologies. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and the authors of the often sensational Historia Augusta portrayed him as a monstrous figure of depravity whose reign represented everything that was wrong with Eastern influence on Roman culture, perpetuating a narrative of moral decay and cultural contamination. Medieval chroniclers largely accepted this negative assessment, often adding their own moral judgments about his sexual and religious behavior, further cementing his reputation as a symbol of decadence and perversion. Modern scholarship has attempted to separate historical fact from ancient prejudice, recognizing that much of what we know about Elagabalus comes from sources that were openly hostile to his reign, potentially distorting or exaggerating certain aspects of his behavior. Contemporary historians acknowledge that Roman authors were often predisposed to view Eastern practices as inherently corrupt and effeminate, making it difficult to objectively assess the emperor's actual innovations and motivations. The question of Elagabalus's gender identity has attracted particular attention from modern scholars, sparking lively debates and diverse interpretations. Some historians argue that the ancient sources describe what would today be recognized as a transgender identity, suggesting that Elagabalus may have been one of the first transgender rulers in recorded history. Others contend that his behavior should be understood within the context of Syrian religious practices, rather than through the lens of modern concepts of gender identity, emphasizing the cultural differences between ancient Rome and the modern world. The religious innovations attempted by Elagabalus represent an early example of the kind of syncretistic religious experimentation that would become increasingly common in the later Roman Empire. His attempt to create a supreme solar deity can be seen as a precursor to some aspects of the religious reforms later implemented by Constantine, albeit through very different methods and with vastly different results. However, his radical methods, disregard for Roman traditions, and poor timing made success ultimately impossible, highlighting the challenges of imposing religious change on a deeply conservative society. The political lessons of Elagabalus's reign extend far beyond questions of religious and social policy, offering valuable insights into the nature of power and the dynamics of political legitimacy. His story illustrates the inherent dangers of disconnection between rulers and the societies they govern, highlighting the importance of understanding and responding to the needs and concerns of the people. No matter how absolute a ruler's power may appear, it ultimately depends on the consent or acquiescence of key social groups, including the military, the aristocracy, and the general populace. When that consent is withdrawn, even emperors are vulnerable to being overthrown. The role of the Syrian women in both elevating and destroying Elagabalus demonstrates the complex and often ruthless dynamics of power in the Roman imperial system, where family loyalty and political ambition often clashed. Julia Maes's decision to sacrifice her own grandson to preserve dynastic power underscores the extent to which political calculation could override even the strongest familial bonds. The successful transition to Alexander Severus proved that the conspiracy had been carefully planned and executed with a clear understanding of the political landscape and the various power dynamics at play. The economic and administrative aspects of Elagabalus's reign provide valuable insights into the practical challenges facing the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, a period marked by increasing economic instability and military pressure. His extravagant spending and neglect of frontier defenses contributed to problems that would continue to plague his successors, highlighting the importance of sound fiscal management and effective military leadership. The empire's financial resources, while vast, were not unlimited, and fiscal irresponsibility had real and lasting consequences. The military dimension of the reign reveals the growing importance of the army in determining imperial succession, with the legions increasingly playing a decisive role in choosing who would rule the empire. While traditional constitutional forms were still maintained, real power increasingly rested with those who could command the loyalty of the military. Elagabalus's neglect of military affairs ultimately proved fatal to his regime, demonstrating the critical importance of maintaining the support of the army. The cultural impact of Elagabalus's reign extended far beyond its immediate political consequences, leaving a lasting mark on Roman society. The clash between Eastern and Western traditions that characterized Elagabalus's rule reflected broader tensions within the empire about identity, belonging, and the very definition of what it meant to be Roman. These tensions would continue to influence Roman society long after the emperor's violent death, shaping the cultural landscape of the late Roman Empire. The historiographical treatment of Elagabalus raises important questions about how gender non-conforming and sexually diverse historical figures have been portrayed throughout history, often being subjected to prejudice, misrepresentation, and outright condemnation. The hostile ancient sources may have exaggerated or distorted aspects of the emperor's behavior to make political points about Eastern influence, proper Roman values, and the perceived dangers of deviating from traditional norms. Recent archaeological evidence from Emesa and other Syrian sites has provided new insights into the religious traditions that Elagabalus attempted to transplant to Rome, offering a more nuanced understanding of his motivations and beliefs. These findings suggest that his innovations were less bizarre from a Syrian perspective than Roman sources often suggested, representing genuine religious practices rather than simply personal perversions. The psychological dimensions of Elagabalus' story continue to fascinate scholars and popular audiences, prompting reflection on the human condition and the corrupting influence of power. The immense pressures of absolute power on a teenager, combined with the cultural displacement of moving from Syria to Rome and the weight of expectations placed upon him, created conditions that few individuals could have navigated successfully. His apparent inability to compromise, adapt to Roman expectations, or build consensus may reflect both his personality traits and the profound cultural differences between Syria and Rome. The legacy of Elagabalus in popular culture has been largely shaped by the sensational aspects of ancient accounts, perpetuating a distorted and often exaggerated image of the emperor. From Renaissance paintings to modern novels and films, he has been portrayed as a symbol of decadence, sexual excess, and unbridled corruption, often serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. These popular representations, while entertaining, often tell us more about the societies that created them than about the historical emperor himself. The broader historical significance of Elagabalus' reign lies in what it reveals about the Roman Empire's capacity for change and adaptation, as well as its limitations and vulnerabilities. While Elagabalus' specific innovations were ultimately rejected, the empire would eventually undergo religious and cultural transformations that were almost as dramatic, demonstrating its ability to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. His failure may have resulted more from poor timing, a lack of political skill, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Roman society than from the inherent impossibility of change itself. In the end, the story of Elagabalus serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of historical interpretation, the dangers of absolute power, and the enduring influence of culture and tradition. Whether viewed as a misunderstood innovator, a mentally disturbed teenager, or a symbol of Eastern corruption, he remains one of history's most fascinating and controversial figures, provoking debate and challenging our assumptions about power, identity, religion, and the very nature of historical truth. His brief reign illuminated the tensions and possibilities within Roman society that would continue to shape the empire's development long after his violent death, leaving an indelible mark on the course of history. The emperor who sought to transform Rome according to his own vision ultimately became a cautionary tale about the limits of imperial power and the importance of understanding the societies one seeks to govern. His legacy continues to provoke debate and reflection more than 18 centuries after his death, ensuring that his name will forever be associated with the complexities and contradictions of the Roman Empire. In attempting to remake Rome in his own image, Elagabalus instead ensured his own destruction and created a historical puzzle that continues to challenge scholars and capture imaginations, serving as a potent reminder of the enduring power of the past. So, as we've explored, the whirlwind reign of Elagabalus wasn't just a story of outlandish behavior and religious upheaval. It was a critical moment that exposed the vulnerabilities and tensions simmering beneath the surface of the seemingly invincible Roman Empire. His attempt to fuse Eastern traditions with the established order ultimately failed, but it served as a powerful catalyst, forcing Rome to confront its own identity, its relationship with its vast territories, and the delicate balance between tradition and change. It's a complex and compelling story, reminding us that even the most powerful empires are constantly evolving and vulnerable to unexpected challenges. What did you find most fascinating about Elagabalus' story? I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or any interpretations you might have in the comments below. Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed diving into this fascinating corner of Roman history, please consider subscribing. That way, you won't miss out on future explorations of intriguing historical figures and events. Thanks for watching.